Okay, so we are going to talk about security on AWS, right? So yesterday we just started off, right? So we'll continue with that, right? So we know that security on AWS, it follows the shared responsibility model, right? So in the shared responsibility model, both the customer and AWS is responsible for it. So here I quickly have a slide, some slides, right? Some high level stuff, right? So who manages which parts, right? So we saw this yesterday, right? So you have this security of the cloud, security in the cloud, right? So AWS manages certain stuff, and we are responsible for managing certain stuff. So here is just the high level, right, the representation of the shared responsibility model, but it is going to vary depending upon the service that you use, right? So up to this, whatever you see orange, right, so is always managed by AWS. That means the customer never has access to the software on which AWS is, is deployed on, or the physical infrastructure, right? So apart from that, you have these things on top, right? So even these things, in some cases, you might not have access. So here, if you go, so it depends upon what type of service you are going to use, right? So this is just a general representation, but this dotted line is going to vary, right? So depending on what type of service you are using, are you using S3, are you using EC2, right? Are you using Docker, RDS, right? So depending on the service, you will see a variation, something like this. Suppose you take some infrastructure services, maybe like EC2, right? So here you have access to almost everything on top. That is, you can control encryption, the network traffic, operating system, firewall configuration, what you put inside the machine, and of course the customer data, right? So the customer content or the data will always is the responsibility of the customer, right? So if you go for EC2, like I said, right? So you have the responsibilities, right? So AWS takes care of the core networking, right? The backend networking, the backend hardware, software, right? Those things, and you take care of the OS, firewall, antivirus, encryption, what applications you install, the data that you store, right? So if you take, for example, the container services, suppose like something like Docker or something like that, you're using, right? Again, there will be some variation, right? So up to which layer you can access, which layers AWS takes care of, right? So it depends on service to service. You take, for example, RDS, right? So on RDS, you don't have access to the operating system or the platform or the application. You have access only to the data, who can access that data, right? Availability type, encryption, scaling, all these you have access, right? So it basically depends upon the service. Abstract services means maybe something like S3, right? So in S3, you don't manage the platform or the application or the operating system or the network firewall configuration. You configure encryption, who is able to access the data, right? And of course, the data is always the customer's responsibility, right? So it depends, right, on what type of service you are using, right? So it is always a shared responsibility model, right? It's always going to be the shared responsibility model. Okay. So when you talk about security of the cloud, again you have all this stuff, right? And then we saw what are the uh, compliance models, right? Right, assurance and compliance, all these ISO, all these standards. So all these you have to make sure that uh, you make sure that you follow this in case you need to do it, right? So AWS just provides the guidelines, and remember, all services may not be compliant to all these standards. So again, those things the security teams, they have to check in case you need to follow those standards, right? Okay, so all this, if you want, I'll share this presentation, right? So don't worry too much about this. This is just you need to know like at a high level, right? So apart from this, I told you about certain things like the penetration testing, right? Yesterday, right? So what is allowed, what is for what you have to take permission, right? So you have to be a little bit aware of those things, right? And then you have another topic which comes up in the exam, that is called storage decommissioning, right? What is storage decommissioning, right? So AWS has a lot of storage, right? So whether you're using EC2 or S3 or whatever, right? You store some data, and AWS, where is the data going to be stored? On some disks, right? On some media, right? So from time to time, AWS will need to replace these disks, either for upgrading or they have gone bad, right? So when they replace the storage media, basically, what happens to the old media, right? What happens to the old media? Either they became, they had some problem, they're faulty, right? Or upgrade or something they're doing, they need to replace. So what happened to the old disk? Any idea? Right? So what AWS,
From they will, I mean, based on this, I mean, security level, they, I mean, reuse their device or sometime they were
no, we are not talking about
just track
reuse. They are going to replace, so they are going to remove it. So what they do, like you said, is they are going to destroy it.
just track.
So they are
Yes,
responsible for that. You are not responsible for that, right? So
yes,
in the exam, you will get a question, right, about this thing. So you are not responsible for it. So AWS have their own standards to either. So they are not simply going to take the disk and scrap it, because if they do something like that, it is possible for the other person to recover the data. So they are going to do some high level, what do you say, low level full format or something like that. Or if the drive is faulty, they are not able to access it, they might physically destroy the drive, right? So AWS takes care of that storage decommissioning. You don't have to do anything. You just worry about your encryption if you want to keep your data safer. Encryption at rest, right? Storage decommissioning, AWS takes care. It is not your responsibility, it is AWS's responsibility, right? For example, if you're using a snowball, right, snowball or snowmobile, right? So they reuse the same device again. So they formatted low level format so that the next customer accessing that data, sorry, that physical media, the old data is not accessible. So they take care of the storage decommissioning for you, and you don't have to worry about all those things. That is one more thing you want to know, right? So apart from that, we have a lot of other small stuff, right, in security, right? Just high level, which you need to know, right? Apart from this penetration testing, it might not come up in the exam, but just it was there in the old exam, I think, but now I don't think it comes, right? So it just talks about the infrastructure security, or what do you say? You can say security in their data centers. That, that is also not your responsibility, but what they do, just high level, right? So if you are working in a data center, right? So what type of security do you have, right? What are the different things that you need to take care of, right? So one is physical security, right, of the building, of the premises, right? Who is allowed to enter, access control, who is allowed to access the floor, right? Who is allowed to access the servers? Access means, right, for maintenance, repairs, upgrades, installations. So they will have their own hierarchy, right? So who is allowed to enter which parts of the data center? Who is allowed to do that? All that AWS takes care. This we don't do anything, right? This is just high level information, right? So you can't go, even if you're a AWS customer, you cannot enter there the data center, right? So AWS employees, they have their own security and the process to what do you say, uh, who's allowed to enter, right? Security alarms, CCTV cameras, right? All those type of things. Next is something related to fire detection and suppression, right? So all these we don't do, AWS takes care. So they have process, right? Alarms, right? Uh, to detect where there is a fire, to put it off, right? So they have mechanisms to handle all these things, right? Uh, Power backup, UPS, right? If the UPS generators, right? So all these they take care of. So right, they have their own the maintenance teams, right? Air conditioning or climate control as they call it, right? To maintain the appropriate temperature for the servers, right? So they have their own electrical maintenance teams, right? So all these AWS takes care of, right? And then what do you say? Uh, yeah, the important thing what comes up in the exam is storage device decommissioning, right? So after the storage device has what do you say, failed, or it has reached its end of life, right? So they are going to do some sort of action on it, right? So to prevent the data from being accessed by whoever they are scrapping it to or whatever, so they take care of that process, either full format or low level format or physically destroying the drive. So this also AWS takes care of, right? Apart from that, we saw what is a region, what is an availability zone, right? All these are what do you say, also you can say they come under security, right? So all these AWS take care of, right? All these things they take care of. Also the network to an extent, right? So you have access only to the security group, ACL, those type of thing, but the backend network, right? The backbone, right? So they take care of it, protecting you to an extent from DDoS attacks, man in the middle attacks, right? IP spoofing, right? All these type of stuff. And about the penetration testing, we saw yesterday that what you are allowed to do, what you are not allowed to do, and what is the process to handle those type of things. Okay, so these are mostly AWS responsibilities, right? And this thing you should be aware of, right? Now coming to the little core about security. Okay, okay. So now we'll talk about the credentials, right? So far, how are you accessing AWS? You're accessing AWS from the console, right? And how are you logging in? You're using your email address and password, right? So you created your AWS account using this email ID and password, right? So this combination of email ID and password is called the root account, right? So the email ID and password with which you created your AWS account, right, is called the root account. The username is not root. The username is your email ID and the password is your password. So this combination is called the root account, and there will be only one root account. You can't have two root accounts. Okay. The email address and password which you use to create your AWS account is called the root account, and there will be only one root account, and this root account will have full privileges, full permissions on everything. You can't modify the permissions. You cannot modify the root account's permissions. It will always have full permission. That is everything. All services, billing, all those kind of stuff, it is going to be uh, having full permissions, right? Uh, yeah. So in real time, nobody is going to use the root account, right? So you should not use the root account for everyday admin. It will work, you can use, but it is not a security best practices, right? Okay, it is not a good practice to use your root account for everyday administration. But obviously, root account, you need to create your AWS account, you need this combination, right? So root account don't use for what is everyday administration or everyday use, right? So what account do you use, right? So you create additional users for the employees or people who are going to access your AWS account. So obviously you create your AWS account, you have the root account. So you first you log in with your root account because you don't have any other account. So you log in with root account, and then what you do is you go into a service called IAM, which we will be seeing, and then you create individual users, right? Say for example you have some A, B, C, D, 4 employees. Say you are A, right? And then you have other B, C, D, some 3 employees who are going to use this AWS account. So what you do is first you use a root account. First you use an email and password. So again here another thing is what email and password you are going to use. If it is your personal account, you will use your personal email ID. But we are talking at a, what do you say, enterprise company level. So what email ID will you use, right? So you can use your company email ID also. It is not wrong. It will work. But it is not a good practice to use some individual's email address, because tomorrow if this guy he leaves the company, usually they will deactivate the email ID. Then if you need to log into the root account, you will be able to log in, but if you need to recover password or something, right, it will become a problem because your email ID is no longer valid, right? So always try to avoid using an individual's email address to create an account. Try to use a group email, right? Try to use your group email address to create a AWS account. So you might have, for example, what do you say, DevOps at yourcompany.com or something, right? Cloud team at yourcompany.com or something. So try to use the group email always for the root account in a enterprise. Try to avoid using individual IDs. It is not wrong, but it is not the recommended what do you say, practice, right? So say for example you are using some email ID you created the root account, right? So what you do is you log in with the root, you go into a service called IAM, and you create individual users, including for you. You create a user called A, you create a user called B, create a user called C, and create a user called D, and then you log out of the root account and you keep it aside for emergency use. From now, you have to log in using A, B has to log in using B, C with C, and D with D. So everybody should have their separate credentials. Why? Because it is security best practice, because you can track who is doing what. If you give everybody the same ID, then you will not be able to know which user actually is doing that action, what is happening in your account. So all these are free, creating users and all that is free, right? So even if C and D, they belong to the same team, they need the same permissions, you give separate ID for C and D. You don't create one, suppose say C and D are DBA. So don't create one user called DBA and ask both of them to use the same thing. What you can do is you can create a group called DBA, and you can add C and D to the DBA group, right? Because you have to assign the permissions to the user. So after you create users, you have to assign the permissions. So maybe because you are the administrator, right? Right. So maybe you might get full access. That is full admin access. So maybe B is a say a network team. So he gets access to the network related services. C and D are DBA, so maybe they get access to the database related services. So you can control the permissions also, right? So you create the users and you give them whatever permission they require. So don't make everybody admin again. So we have to follow the principle of least privilege, right? Anywhere for that matter. So you have to give the user whatever the minimum permission he requires to complete his work, right? Say for example, you have a user called D. Maybe he is a HR person or something, or you are using a user to back up your data to S3. Say you have a server, right? So you are taking some application backup or a DB backup or something, you want to upload it to S3. So maybe you are creating a script which is going to take a backup, right, and upload to S3 bucket, right? So maybe it is a backup user. So these don't have to be like physical users, they can be for this type of things also, right? So in order to access S3, you need to give credentials. Simply you can't upload files to S3, right? So maybe you created a user and you put those credentials in your script, right, to upload files. So here what permission you have to give this user? You have to give this user only upload permission to that particular bucket, maybe backup bucket. So you should not give permission to download, rename. This all not required. This process needs to only upload files. It does not need to download or remove the files or anything. So the files which this user is uploading, he will not even be able to download or remove or rename or anything like that, right? So if somebody needs to only upload files, you give only the upload permission. You don't need to give full permission on the bucket, right? So that we have to control. We will see how to control that, right? So always the credentials have to be for individual users and the permissions have to be only what is required for their job. Don't give excess permission, because afterwards if you want, if they get approval, you can add the additional permissions. So always give the minimum required permissions, and if multiple people they require the same set of permissions, you can add them to a group. So don't just create one user and give that to all the people in that team or something like that, right? Create individual users but add them to a group and you can assign your permission to the group. So everybody in that group will get the same permissions, right? So these are some of the things that you have to keep in mind, right? So root account, you just after you create your user, you keep the root account aside for emergency purpose in case you forgot your own password, right? Then to change that password you need the root account, right? So for certain things you need the root account, right? Certain things are possible only with the root account. Some 6 or 7 things are there for which you compulsory need the root account, right? So you have root account and you have IAM users. So there is only one root account. IAM users you can have as many as you want, right? And you can give the permissions. Root account you can't modify the permissions. You can only change the password or you can change the email address also, right? But you can't control the password, right? So but you need the root account for certain operations. For example, if you want to change your email address, right, these you can't do from an IAM user, right? If you want to change the root account's email address, right, you want to change the password, obviously you have to log in as a root user, right? So if you want to update what do you say, the contact information, right, the payment currency type, sorry, I think contact info, this you can do from IAM also, right? But what do you say, to manage your account name, password, for this you need the, for the root account you need the root account. Obviously you can't control from another user, right? For certain tax invoices, right, you might never use these things, but for these things you need the root account, right? If you want to close your AWS account, right, maybe some IAM user, right, like I said, you are the administrator, right? So you control everything, you control the other users permissions and all those things. Suppose you forget your own password, then to reset the password for A, right, you need to log in as the root and then change the password for A. something like this. You want to what do you say? Change your support plan, right? For that, you need to do it from the root account, right? Uh, so these are some of the things. So again, there are a couple of more stuff, right? So like you want to use the AWS, the Gov Cloud. So then you have to put a request from the root account, right? So these are some of the things which need root account, which is not possible for from IAM. But for everything else, you can use what do you say? IAM users, right? Right. So there is one thing which can affect the permissions of the root account. We will see that when we go to AWS organizations. But in general, the root account will have full permissions, but there is an indirect way of limiting the permissions of a root account. Right? There is an indirect way of limiting the permissions of a root account, but we will see that. Right? We'll see that when we go to AWS organizations. Right? Using something called a service control policy, right? For people who are using multiple AWS accounts, right? Companies which use multiple AWS accounts. So there you can enforce some rules that limit the permissions of a root account also. Okay. So guys, please give me 2 minutes. I'll just be back. I have a call from office. Okay. So just give me 2 minutes. I'll be back. Yeah. So let us continue. Right. So we have these called the IAM users, right? So which are additional users. So we will see how to manage these users and all that stuff, right? So even before going into the IAM users, right? So AWS has some best practices for the root account, right? So in my probably in my AWS account, you might not be able to see those things, but yeah, I'll try to log into my root account, right? So currently I'm not logged in as a root account. I'm logged in as an IAM user called demo, right? But still you can access the service called IAM, right? So I have created a user for myself called demo, and I've given that user full permissions, right? So you use a service called IAM to manage the users, and IAM is a global service, right? You don't create the users in a region, right? You just create the users, and you can give them access to the different resources in different regions, right? So you don't create a user in any region as such, right? It is a global service. It does not depend upon a region, right? So the user you create, you just create in IAM. Then for that user, you can give different permissions. So for example, here if I go, I have the users. So here you see I have a lot of users. So here you see I have a user called demo, right? And I have a group called admin, right? So for this admin group, I have given like full permissions, right? I've given administrator access for that. So everybody in this group will get the full permission. So there are two users in this group, right? They have full permissions like that. So, or if you want, you can add a what do you say? A user. See, I have a user called Packer, right? So for this user, I have given some permissions. We'll see how to do these things, right? So for this user, I have given some permissions, right? What they are allowed to do, right? So like this, you can create users, as many users as you want. It is all free, and you can give them some permissions, right? You can give them the permissions that they require. Okay. So we will see how to do these things. But usually when you log into your AWS account, right? So here you might see some alerts, right? So I cannot show you that because mine is not a new account. But yeah, you might see certain things over here. You need to make sure that those are all set. One of that is enabling multi-factor authentication for the root account. And here are some best practices that AWS is saying, right? Use the principle of least privilege, right? Make sure that you have multi-factor authentication, you rotate your credentials frequently, all these things, right? So we'll see a few of those things, right? So one of the first things they recommend is you enable multi-factor authentication. What is multi-factor authentication? Any idea?
like password with the OTP.
Yes. So what AWS recommends is enable MFA at least for root account. So it is not compulsory, it is recommended. So how do you log in with the root account? You go to the AWS console, right? Console.aws.amazon.com, right? You go to the console URL, right? And what you do, you enter the username and you enter the password. That is your email and your password. And then you log in. This is the normal. What AWS recommends is enable multi-factor authentication. Like you said, it is a OTP, right? Or two-factor authentication, whatever you want to call, right? They are all fall under the umbrella of multi-factor authentication. So what happens is when you enable MFA, right? So after you go to the console, you enter your username and password, then it will ask you for the MFA code or OTP. After you provide that code, right, then you will be able to log in. So how to do this? How do you enable MFA? You can enable MFA for the root. You can enable MFA for the IAM users also. A lot of companies, they use MFA for IAM users also. But AWS recommends at least for root you enable that, right? Which is why you will see a warning over here, because I have not enabled MFA for the root, right? It says the root user for this account does not have MFA, right? Enable MFA to improve security for this account. So I can't enable MFA from here because I'm not logged in as the root account, right? Nobody else can manage the permissions of the root account. Only the root account can log in and what do you say? Uh, Change the password, change the email, enable MFA, right? But your IAM user can manage other IAM users, right? So I created a user called demo, which has full permissions, which does not mean I can go and manage the root account. Root account I can't manage, right? Root account can be managed only through root account. But as this user demo who has full permissions, I can go and modify the password for other people, right? So for example, say I have a user called here, right? So here I can go and change this user's password if I want, right? I can go and change that user's password, right? Or I can what do you say, enable, disable the user, all those things. Here the console access is disabled, so I can enable console access. I can manage this user's password. I can manage other users, but I can't manage the root account. So to use the root account, you need to be logged in as the root account. Okay, so I'll try to log in as my root account. It has been a while. I'm not sure if I remember the password, but let me see. Right? But what is this MFA? Right? What is this MFA code? How do you get the code? So basically, now there are two ways. One is using a hardware key fob, right? Using a hardware device, or using a what do you say, a software or a virtual appliance or a virtual tool, right? So have you used any tool to generate OTP on your phone?
Uh, yes, in our company we use Ping ID for generate this kind of token.
Yeah, so there are a lot of such tools, right? So basically
Yes.
they have to support the TOTP standard. So you have like Google Authenticator, right?
Yeah.
WinAuth. So like this, there might be other tools. So what is the tool that you use?
Ping ID.
Can you spell that out?
Ping, Ping,
Okay,
ID.
Ping ID. Let us see what
Yeah.
that is.
In my previous company, we use like some other tool.
Okay, so it is like some software view install, right? Or it has
Yes, yes,
hardware also,
yes,
right? So probably they have a multi-factor authentication, right?
yes.
You
Yeah,
can
correct.
install the software and you generate the code, right? So same thing, there are tools like Google Authenticator.
And Symantec tool also there.
Yeah. So there are a lot of tools, right?
Yes,
So you
yes.
can use this two-step verification or multi-factor with your Gmail account, right? So with a lot of things these days, right? Or you have something called WinAuth, right? Which is again an open source authenticator, right? Which supports different things, right? So for example, I use WinAuth, So it is a right. So here I can add my account. Right, I can add a Gmail account, I can add an AWS account, right, and I can what do you say? I can I hit refresh, it will show me the code OTP. Right, it syncs with your date and time and a secret key that you provide, and it generates the OTP. Right. So earlier they used to support SMS. Now they don't support SMS. Right. Earlier it was possible to receive the OTP via SMS. Now it is not supported. They have removed support for SMS. Right. For receiving the MFA. Right. So how to configure this? See, right. We will not be using a hardware device because you have to pay for the hardware device, and it might not support all features. So most of them use the software or the virtual tool to generate the OTP. But it is possible to use a hardware device. Hardware device means you might have used in the past, right? Some a decade ago or something. Some banks, some VPN providers, they used to provide a small, what do you say, a USB type of
Like
looking thing with a small display where the key used to change every minute or something like that, right? So
RSA token.
yeah, RSA token or something, right? So now it is possible to do. You can use those type of devices also, right? They are also supported, right? So you can use either a hardware device as a multi-factor authentication device, or a software installed on your phone or your laptop to get the code. So please give me a minute. I'll try to log in as the root account. Just give me a minute. I'll see whether I can remember the password for my root account. So how do you log in as the root account? You go to console.aws.amazon.com and then you enter your username and password, right? And you choose root user. You don't choose IAM user. So far you have been using the root user. So let me try to log in and see. Let me see if I can remember my password. Yes, I have been able to log in. Okay. So here I'm logged in as my root account, right? Here you see I'm logged in as my root account, not as IAM user, right? I'm not a IAM user. Now I'm logged in as my root account. So I can go to IAM, right? It is the same AWS account, but now I have logged in as the root user. It didn't ask me for any OTP. So I straight away logged in, right? So now it is recommended to enable MFA at least for the root user. So you can go here and you can say enable MFA, right? It will ask you to activate MFA, right? So when you click on this, it will show you, right? So do you want to use a virtual MFA or do you want to use a hardware? Both these are hardware, right? So if you click on this, it will show you more information about them, right? So MFA is available in these form factors, that is virtual MFA software, and all these other are hardware, right? If you're using the US Go Cloud, they have a separate hardware key for that. So you can purchase these things from these links. From Amazon, you can purchase, right? If you want to use this U2F security key, it is something like which you plug in, right? It doesn't have a OTP as such. It is like a USB device which you plug in, which is configured for your account, right? You plug it in, you are allowed to log in, right? It is available in these form factors that you can buy, right? Or you don't want something like that. You want a hardware key fob, right? Which is like you said, it looks like your RSA token. You can buy something like this. You don't want something like this. You want something that looks like a credit card. You can purchase this, right? All these are basically hardware devices. Suppose you are working in the Go Cloud, they have a specific what do you say, device that you have to use, right? From Secure Pass, right? So all these are hardware form factors, which basically which sync up and generate the OTP. So we are not going to use this hardware. We will use the virtual MFA device, which is basically your software based, either on your phone or your system, right? So these are applications which support the TOTP standard. So what are the supported, or what are some of the things that you can use? That is what they have given, right? So you can use Authy, LastPass, Microsoft Authenticator, Google Authenticator, any of these things you can use, right? right, to generate the OTP, right? So if you see the virtual MFA, it supports everything, right? It can be used in the cloud also. It can be used with the root account. It can be used with the IAM users. But the other things, they have some limitations, right? You can't use these three hardware devices with the cloud. For that, you need a separate, uh, what do you say, hardware device. And same thing, the the cloud's hardware key fob, it does not support the root account, right? So, but the virtual MFA, it supports everything. Can be used anywhere. It supports everything, right? So a lot of people use virtual MFA, and it is free also, right? You don't pay anything for it. Earlier they had SMS also, but now SMS is no longer supported. Earlier you could get the OTP via SMS, but now it is not there anymore, right? So how do you configure your virtual MFA? So obviously, first of all, you need to install your virtual MFA, right? So you install the software either on your phone or on your laptop. The process is more or less the same. The GUI might be a little different. So I'm using WinAuth. So you open WinAuth, right? And you go over here and you say, I want to use virtual MFA, right? And hit continue, right? So it will ask you to install the app on your phone or your computer. So after you have installed it, right? I have installed it. We have finished the step one. So it will ask you to scan the QR code. If you are using it on your phone, you can scan the QR code, right? If you are not using it on the phone, right, like I'm using here, I can't scan the QR code, right? So what I will do is I will go here and I will say add. So here you will normally see AWS, but mine is slightly older version, so AWS is not there. So I can simply say create an authenticator, right? I can just call it AWS, right? Something like this, right? So if you are working with multiple AWS accounts, or you have multiple AWS users, right? For each of them, you can create a configuration. Like here you see, I already have two AWS accounts that I work with. For that, I have, right? So if you're creating another user or another AWS account, you can add it over here. So I am creating a MFA for the root account. So I can say AWS India demo root account, so that I know it is for this AWS account, right? And the user is the root user, right? And here you have to provide the secret key. Secret key is what is provided by AWS. You don't provide your account ID, email address, all that you don't provide. AWS gives you a secret key, or you scan the QR code. If you're using the Google Authenticator or something, you scan this QR code, or you can say show secret key and you copy the secret key and you put it in your authenticator. Simple as that. Once you put this over here, right, you say verify authenticator. So what it is going to do is it is going to automatically start generating the code, right? So here you have to enter two consecutive MFA codes. In the AWS console, you have to enter two consecutive MFA codes to sync it up, right? So it starts generating the code. You can take any two consecutive codes and enter it here. Okay, I'm going to do that now. 334122. Okay, 334122. I have entered one code. So I will wait for the next code. Right, 261185. Right. So once you enter two consecutive MFA code, you can say assign MFA. If these codes are correct and synced up, it will add. Once you add that, you can close this and you can save this. You can say OK and save this. Now here you see I've added the other account. Now if I try to log into this account, right? Now if I try to log into the root account, let me log out. Right. Now if I go here and say sign into the console, right, as the root user, right? So it will ask me for the password, right? Now after entering the password, it will ask you for MFA. Right? So how do you enter the MFA? You open your software, you open that particular account and you hit refresh or whatever, and it generates the code, right? only then you will be able to log in, right? So it is recommended to enable the MFA at least for your root account. If you don't want MFA, you want to disable MFA, you can go and do that, right? You can go to your security credentials over here, right? You can go directly over here and you can go to multi-factor authentication and you can disable, or you want to sync it again, right? You can do that. If you don't want, you can remove this, right? So once you remove MFA, it is not going to ask you for MFA again. You just put your username, password, and you log in, right? So MFA can be used for root users. It can be used for IAM users also, right? So AWS recommends you use it at least for the root user, right? So afterwards you can remove that entry in your authenticator app. It does not matter whether it is there or no once you remove it from here, right? So there you go with enabling multi-factor authentication for your root account, right? So probably you guys can also enable that and try it out, right, for the root user, right? Okay. So now we have spoken about the root user. We have been using the root user. Sorry. Now we will go into the IAM users. How do you create your users? How to log in? Some basic stuff, right? So I'm going to do it from another IAM user. I'm not going to do it from a root user, right? It is the same thing, right? So you can log in from the root account, go to users, create users, or I created a user for myself called demo, which has full permission. So he will be able to do everything. Whatever the root account can do, almost everything he can do except those 6 or 7 which I listed a few minutes ago, right? So this user has full permissions. He can manage IAM also, right? Now let us say, for example, you have an employee in your account called say Harry or something, right? Let us say you have a user called Harry, right? And I am the user demo. So I created a user called demo, gave this user full permissions. Now I logged in as demo and I'm going to create the user Harry, right? Say Harry is a trainee, right? So he needs some specific permission. He does not need admin permissions. So we'll go ahead, we'll create a user Harry. So how do you create a user? You go to IAM and you say, go to users and you say add user. You give the username, right? So I'm going to call this user Harry, right? So the next thing is coming, access type. What do you mean by this access type, right? So I told you basically there are two ways in which you can interact with AWS or use AWS. One is programmatic, one is console, right? In the beginning class I told you, right? What is console? This management console, right? So AWS has only one GUI, that is the AWS management console. Anywhere else you are using, right, any other third-party tool, it can be GUI also. It is not GUI. Officially, it is not GUI. It is programmatic access. The only GUI is this AWS management console, right? So if you are using the management console, you are given a ID and a password, right? If this user Harry wants to use AWS, right, from the AWS console, then he gets a username and password combination. If this user is going to do programmatic access, what is programmatic access? Anything other than the console, whether he is using the CLI, whether he is using the SDK, whether he is using the APIs, right? Anything other than the console is programmatic access. So say for example, I think I showed you some third-party tool for S3, right? With which you can access S3. It is a GUI tool, right? It is a client. It is a S3 client, right? Let me open that. Yeah, here. Right. So it is a tool which can connect to S3 and other storage services. Right. So here, if I want to connect to S3, right, I can't give my username and password. It will not work. It asks for something called the access keys. These keys are different from your, what do you say, your EC2 keepers. Your EC2 keeper is for accessing the OS. That is for logging into the OS. That is different. Right? These keys are to access AWS services. They are like your credentials. Right? So anything other than the AWS console, even if it is a GUI tool, you can't use your username and password. It will not work. Okay. For that, you need something called access keys. That is, it is a combination of an access key ID and a secret access key. So think of this like the username and this as the password. But even though it's not the correct term, right? It is a combination of two keys. One is called the access key and one is called the secret access key, right? For programmatic access. So whether you're using command line interface, programming, coding, APIs, SDKs, want to interact with AWS, you provide this key. Okay. So now say for example, this user Harry, he needs only the console access. He is not doing any programmatic access, right? And another thing to remember is you can't interchange. You can't use your access key and secret access key in the console. You can't use your console username and password in the, what do you say, in the access key and secret. It doesn't work, right? It will not work, right? So first I will give this user management console access, AWS management console access, which is our official GUI, right? And the password, you can create the password or you can say auto generated password. I will just put some password. All these are some basic configurations when you create a user, right? So I will just create a password, right? So I've created a password and you can say the user must create the password at next login. If you want, you can keep this enabled so that when this user logs in, it will ask it to change the password. Again, it's a good practice, right? But I'm just not going to enable that for now. And then the next step is you can add permissions for this user, right? You're creating a user Harry. So now for this user, what permissions to give, right? So I'm not going to give any permissions now. I'll just leave it blank. So by default, the user does not have any permissions, right? By default, he is not going to get any permissions. I'm not going to add him to any group. I'm not going to add any permissions. So I will just click next, right? And I'll say review and create. So I'm creating a user called Harry who has permission to the management console with password, right? And we have given some password and all that stuff, right? So I'm saying create user. Okay. So this user has been created. If you click on this, it will open your Outlook or your email client and it will fill up certain information, right? So it will fill up. So if I click on this, it will open something like Outlook and say, hello, you have been you have been provided access to the management console access for this AWS account. Here is the link that you can log in and here is your username. The password will be provided separately. So you have to give the user the password, right? Okay. So now how is Harry going to log into AWS? That is the next question, right? So he is going to log in through the console, right? So he is going to open the browser. He is going to go to aws.amazon.com and he will go to my account and he will go to management console. Now Harry is not the root user. He has to say IAM user and he has to give the 12-digit account number because two AWS accounts might have the same username, right? Your account and my account, both of us can have Harry. So how is it going to know to which account? You have to provide the account number. And again, it is difficult to remember the account number. If you are working with multiple AWS accounts and you have 3 or 4 things, right? It is difficult to remember the account number every time. So what can you do? Here you can enter your account number and hit next, then it will ask you for the username. But what people usually do is, right? So when you go to the IAM dashboard, right, on top, here it will give you the URL, right, for IAM users. The root account is going to log in from what do you say, the main URL, that is console.aws.amazon.com/console. There you log in as the root user. So IAM users are going to use this URL. Usually it will be in the first part here, right? You will have your account number. You can replace this with whatever you want, right? I have replaced it with AWS India. If you go and see in your account, it will be https colon your account number dot signin dot aws.amazon.com/console. So here is the URL for the IAM user. So you give this URL to the user, he can bookmark this. He doesn't have to remember your account number, right? So here, if you see, for example, I have a lot of AWS accounts bookmarked here, right? So if you look at the URL, it will have the account number dot signin dot aws dot amazon dot. So if I want to log into this account, I go to this. If I want to log into root, I go into this, right? If I want to log into another AWS account, I have its IAM user, right? Like this, right? So you just take, you provide the link to the user. He can bookmark it. He can just click on that appropriate link, and he just puts his username. The account number is automatically filled up, right? So you can customize this URL, right? You can edit this. You can rename AWS India to. I mean, you can put whatever name you want. If you don't put an alias, it will usually be your account number dot signin dot aws.amazon.com. So here you see, when I use that link, automatically it fills up my account number, and then now I can enter the username and I can enter my password and I can log in. So now what will the user Harry be able to do, right? So any idea what he will be able to? Now say Harry is logged in and he is going to EC2. So here what is it saying? It is giving error, right? Earlier it used to come with a different error. Now they're saying API. So remember, everything in AWS is API driven, right? Everything is an API call. Everything, when you're saying create instance, launch instance, right? Everything is like a API action, right? So anyway, here it is giving error, but here I am logged in as a user with full permissions, right? A demo user. So if I log in as the demo user and go to EC2, what am I able to see? I'm able to see a lot of stuff. I'm able to see the key pairs, snapshots, security groups. If I click on security groups, I can see what are all the security groups. But this user Harry, he is not able to even see anything. Says you are not authorized to perform this operation. Say he goes to S3. Right here also it is giving same thing. Right? It is not going to show any buckets, saying you don't have permission to list buckets. Right? So if you don't, by default the user has no permission unless you add permission. So user can just log into the console. He cannot even see anything. Right? You should not assume that the user will be able to see the buckets, will see what is there. No, that is also not possible. He is just able to log in. He can't do anything. Maybe he can change his password. Apart from that, he can't do anything. He can click on any service. It will not even show what is there. Right? So here you see, he cannot even see the security group or what is there or something. If he goes to say create security group, it might show the option. But when you try to do anything, it will not even show what VPCs are there. Right? So you should not assume that the user can see everything. Right? So here it will not show the VPC. So even if you enter a VPC ID or something, it will not work. This user can't do anything. He can just log in and be there. Right? But if you don't add, he does not get any permissions. Okay? Unless you add the user to a group. If you add the user to a group, right? Now here you see I have some groups. What is group? It's just a collection of users, right? So if I add the user Harry into the admin group, then he will get the permissions assigned to the admin group. So he will become an admin. Or I can manage the permissions individually. I don't want to add Harry to any group. Now I can attach permissions to the user, right? So we'll talk about permissions also, right? So how to attach permissions, right? So here with what do you say? So same thing. So suppose this user Harry needs to access from the programmatic access, right? So we have a user Harry. Now say he needs programmatic access. So you can go to security credentials and you can manage this user, right? So if you want to, if say Harry he forgot the password or you want to change his password, you can change the password. Or if somebody asks you to deactivate the user Harry, you can deactivate. That is, you can disable the user. You're not removing the user. You're just disabling the user. That is, he will not be able to log into the console, right? You can disable the access. You can change his password in case he forgot the password, right? These things you can manage over here. Or if you want to now give the user access to programmatic access, you can do that also, right? So how do you give programmatic access to the user? You just scroll down to access keys, right? And you create a access key, right? You don't enable programmatic access over here. You just create access key for the user, right? Access key is a combination of a access key and secret access key. So you can say create access key, right? And it will automatically create a access key ID and a secret key. This you have to keep careful because after this you cannot recover this information. You can see the access key ID, but the secret key is shown only now. You save it or you copy it and keep it, because once I hit close, you cannot recover the secret key, right? If you lose this combination or you forget this combination, you create a new access key. You remove the existing access key, you make it inactive or you totally remove it and you create a new access key. You can't edit this access key or like that, right? It is randomly generated. If you lose this secret key, you forgot it, you can't recover it. You remove this, you use a new access key combination, right? Even though they say access key, it is a combination of access key and secret access key. So now say for example, now I have given programmatic access. Now this user he wants to connect to S3. So here if he puts Harry and his password, it will not work, right? It will not work, right? So you have to provide the key because it is programmatic access. Anything other than the AWS console is programmatic access. So if you are using a third party tool, like I told you, right, you have some tool for log analysis, logly, all those places you have to give only your access key and secret access key, right? Here you say now he has been able to log in, but it says access denied. Why? Because he does not have access to S3 to even to see what is there, right? So he goes here, same thing. He is not able to see what is there. He is authenticated, but he is not authorized, right? So here you have two concepts, right? Authentication and authorization, right? Authentication and authorization. They are two different things, right? Authentication is what? Like his credentials, username, password. So he is authenticated. Authorization is what he is allowed to do. What is he allowed to do? Simply because he has credentials, he cannot do everything, right? So you can control that permissions for the user. Authentication is just username, password, or key. It does not mean he can do something. It is just he is authorized to log into that application or log into that service. What is he allowed to do depends upon authorization or what we call as the permissions or the policies, right? So in IAM, these are the basic thing, right? You have the users, you have the groups, and you have the policies. The policies are basically the permissions which you define, right? They are defined in a JSON document, right? So you create some policy and you attach it either to the group or you attach it to the user, basically, right? So in this policy, suppose I'm saying I'm giving S3 read only access, and I attach this to this user Harry. So he will be able to do the read-only operations on S3. So we will see how to create these policies and all that stuff. Okay. So by default, the user has no permissions, whether it is from the console or whether it's accessing programmatically, right? So now, for example, if I go and say I give this user some permission, right? So say I'm going to permissions, we will see how to create the policy and all those things, right? So I'm going to say add permission, right? I'm going to see whether I have S3 read only. Yeah. So here I have a policy that says S3 read only access, right? So I'm going to give this user S3 read only access, right? So the policy is defined something like this, right? So he is allowed these actions. Now we will see whether it is going to work or no, right? So now here I am logged in as user Harry, right? Now if I go to the EC2 console, right? Same thing. If I go to the EC2 dashboard, you are going to get error. But if I go to the S3 console and let me try to refresh and see, now you see it is showing the buckets. At least it is showing the buckets, right? So for example, he tries to go here and he goes and tries to empty the bucket, right? So have you guys used S3 recently?
No, sir.
Okay. Okay. Now you see I try to empty bucket, he is getting error because he does not have permission to delete or something. He has only the read only permissions, right? So same thing. Now programmatically, if I try again, let us see if this is now here. You see same thing. He is able to connect using this tool because we have given this the permission, right? We have given the user permission for S3 read only access, and this user has both the console access and he has the programmatic access also. So he is able to both do stuff from the console or do programmatically. Even though it is a GUI, this is actually programmatic. Even though here you use it as a GUI, AWS still considers it programmatic, right? Because everything is a API call. So so suppose now I go here and do something, right? I say create a new folder or something, right? It will not allow me to do, right? It will give error, right? Access denied, right? It will say access denied. So you try to do some access, right? And it is not allowed because you don't have the permission, right? So because I have given only the read only access for this user, right? Okay. So if you don't want this access, you can remove this access. You can remove the user from this group. So now you will not have access, right? Okay. So if we disconnect and try to reconnect again, right? Again, I have to put the username password, but yeah, right here you see again he does not have access, right? So by default, the user he does not have any permission, right? So you create the user, you can either give him console access or you can give him programmatic access or you can give both depending on what that user is going to do, what that user is going to do. And then he is going to get some type of authentication, either username, password, or a combination of the secret key and access key combination. And then the authorization is provided by something called the policies, which we are going to create and attach it either to the group or attach it to the user, right? So these are the basic what do you say stuff, user groups and policies, and then you have something called roles, right? So we'll see what are these roles uh, in the coming class, right? So too much if we go also, it gets confused, it gets confusing, right? So what are service control policies, all these we will see as we go, right? You have another option here called password policy. If you go to account settings, right? So don't worry about security token service, all this, right? So what is this password policy, right? So password policy is basically you can enforce some rules for the password, right? So you can say, you can put conditions like this. So currently my password policy says it has to be minimum six characters. My password expires every 3 months, that is 90 days, right? And whenever the password expires, only the administrator can reset the password, right? Allow users to change their own password and remember last three passwords and prevent reuse. So like this, you can modify the policy. You can say change password policy, right? And you have a lot of options. So you can say minimum has to be 8 characters. It has to have one uppercase, one lowercase, one number, one special character, right? You can set the password expiration to 1 month or something. So that is up to you, your company's password policies, complexity requirements, so that people just don't use simple password and they never change the password, right? So you can enforce that using these options, this combination of options, right? I hope all these are pretty, what do you say, self-explanatory, right? Right. To prevent password reuse means the user, he cannot use the last three passwords that he has used. Otherwise, the person will say he will change the password again. He will put the same password, right? So you want to avoid that, right? You want to say that the last three passwords that you have used, you can't use. You put some other new password. So you can make it as difficult as you want based on your company's policy. Usually people have 8 characters with one lowercase, one uppercase, one special character, right? At least one of these, at least three of these four, a lot of people use, right? It is simply to make your password stronger, right? Apart from that, if you want more security, you can add multi-factor authentication, right? So all this you are responsible for doing. This is not AWS's responsibility, right? Because if you create the same ID for everybody, then it will become a problem. It will work, but it is a problem when it comes to tracking the users, who is doing what, right? We have a service called CloudTrail, which is used to track the user and API activity, right? Who is doing what in your AWS account can be tracked over here in a service called CloudTrail. We'll talk about CloudTrail also, right? Okay, so again, AWS is updating a lot of their consoles, right? So it might be slightly different if you have used it in the past or you are following some other course or something like that, right? The console might look slightly different. Features are more or less same. The GUI they are changing. Like I said, S3 console, they have made a big change, right? In case you have used S3 recently, you will notice that it has become very irritating to use it from the console, because when you try to do even some basic operations, now you have to click 3 or 4 times, right? So for example here, and let me just show you one bucket, right? So here you see I have a bucket, right? Now if I say upload object, you see the console itself has changed. I have to scroll down to see that, right? Earlier you didn't have to do. Once you click, it used to show all your objects neatly, right? Now if I say upload some object, right, I can say drag and drop some file over here. So let me quickly drag and drop some file. We are just going away from the topic a little bit, but I just want to show you this in case you have not used it, right? Now say I'm uploading some file, I'm dragging and dropping here. Now ideally what you would do, if you don't want to change any options, you used to simply click upload. It used to upload, but now you have to scroll down, right? And you have these additional options, right? You have to, what do you say, click like this, and you have to go down, scroll, and you have to click upload, right? So until 2 days ago, see again, now after you upload, you have to hit exit to go back to the bucket, right? So it has become a little irritating, because until 2 or 3 days ago, while uploading the file also, right, you used to get a box which says that I agree that if the same file is there, it will be overwritten, right? It used to come up. Now they seem to have removed, right? Even 2 days ago it was there. Whenever you try to upload some object, it used to say that one warning used to come here saying that if the object exists, it will be overwritten. You had to say I agree. Now they seem to have removed. People might have probably complained about it. They have removed, but you see, it has become a lot more amount of scrolling to simply upload a file, right? So they have changed a lot of things, right? If you try to remove something or something, the GUI has changed, right? It's a little annoying to use a lot of their present GUIs. Okay, so now coming back to this CloudTrail, so it also comes under security. So we'll talk about CloudTrail now itself. Why separate class? Because anyway we are talking about security, right? So what is CloudTrail? Right, CloudTrail. So it is basically a service in AWS which tracks all the events in your AWS account. Just high level you need to know. It is enabled by default in your account. Earlier you had to enable it manually, right? So CloudTrail is going to create a trail. Trail means your event history, what is happening. So by default, one trail is already enabled, right? So if you go to trails, there is a default trail which is automatically created for you, right? So which is going to track all the events in your AWS account. So the last 90 days events, it is shown here in the console, right? The last 90 days events you can see in the console. If you want older data, then you need to save this in an S3 bucket, right? So when you create a trail or you have your existing trail, you can go and store it in a S3 bucket. So here you see I have specified a S3 bucket so that I can use it for logging, for for auditing purpose. In future, if somebody wants to track my they want to see who is doing what, or some issue happened they want to track, they can go and see the older logs. So older logs, if you want to store them, you store them in a S3 bucket, right? So we will see how to do that, but here I'm just showing you some events, right? The last 3 months events are here itself. You don't need to go to the S3 bucket, right? So if you go to event history, you can see all the last 3 months. So here if you see the most recent activity, you can see that stuff, right? Whatever I have done, right, over here. So what I did, right, I logged in as the user demo. I removed Harry from this group. You see it is tracked. So if you don't have individual user ID, it will become difficult. So who removed Harry from the group? If you have only one account called demo and all the administrators are using the same account, everybody will say I didn't do, right? So here you can see that. So here you see the user Harry, he tried to create a bucket, all this. What happened? Access denied. You saw from this service we tried to create a bucket, he got access denied error, right? You see it is tracked over here, it is logged over here. This user Harry tried to create a bucket with this bucket name in US East 1, access denied. His IP, from which IP Harry has logged in or he sent the request. If you look at this IP, it will be my IP, right? 49.204.176.45, right? So from this IP, Harry has sent a request to create a bucket and access was denied, right? So here you see the demo user, right? I created a user, I added this user to the group, right? Then Harry logged into the console, right? So all actions are tracked over here. So who logged into the console, from where, from which IP they logged into the console, right? So here you see a user called demo, he created a user called Harry, right? And he gave him some permission, right? Programmatic access, right? So earlier we enabled MFA device. I removed and deactivated the MFA device, right? You see everything is tracked over here, right? So yesterday we created some elastic load balancing stuff. You see everything is there. I deleted load balancer, right? Auto scaling we did, right? So all events are tracked over here. All API activity, everything is tracked over here, right? In CloudTrail, right? So if you want to create your own trail, you can. By default, the default trail is there, right? Or you can create a trail. You can give it a name. You can say, do you want to apply it to all regions? You can say yes, so that events from all regions are tracked. If you say no, I want only for specific region, then it is going to do for this region which you are currently logged in, right? So no, I want to track for all regions. right? So if you are using a feature called organizations, which you will see in the coming classes, you can enable it for that. And what you basically need to remember is there are two types of events, right? Basically management and data events. Inside events also, I mean it is a new thing, right? But basically from the exam point of view, you have to remember what is management event and what is data events, right? So management event is like, what do you say, like what you are basically seeing over here, right? What I basically showed you a few minutes ago. So who logged in, who tried to do what, right? Basically what they are trying to do on the resources, right? So do you want to log all events only, or only the read events or the write events? So I want to log everything. I want to log your key management service type events also, which are related to managing your keys in KMS. I want to track everything, whether user is doing some read operation or the write operation. Everything I want to log, right? And what are these data events? Data events is object level activity. So data events are available for S3 and Lambda. Or the same thing you can do from S3 itself, called server access logging. It is basically the same thing, right? So in S3, if you see, you will have something called server access logging for your bucket. So if you want to get, what do you say, object level activity, that is who removed a particular object, because by default those will not be tracked, right? What will be tracked is who tried to create a bucket, right, at the bucket level, right? If you want to track activity that is happening inside the bucket, who deleted an object, who put an object, those things you need to enable object level API activity by going to the data events. So if you want to enable for all buckets, you can enable for all buckets, or if you want to do it for a specific bucket, you can add a specific bucket, and you can say I want to log all the read activity and the write activity for that bucket. So inside that bucket, the objects, whatever is happening, somebody he downloads an object, he uploads an object here, right? So at that level, if you want to track, you can use the data events over here, or you can use S3. Over here you will have server access logging, this new console, no? So here if you go to sorry, I think in the management, not management, it should be here in the properties, sorry, not costs, where is this, man? Yeah, properties. If I go to properties, you will see server access logging, right? So you can do that over here, right? You can enable server access logging, right? So it logs all activity happening in this bucket, right? So we saw this when we were talking about S3 access logging, right? So I told you try to put the logs in a different bucket. Don't use the same bucket to store the logs for this bucket, right? So you can do it from here, or you can do it from CloudTrail, right? So if you want to log object level activity, right, it is not involved in, I mean it is not included in the management events, right? And then you can specify if you want to store the logs, right? You can specify the S3 bucket, right, where you want to store your logs. You can create a folder. All these things you can enable, and you can say create. So it will create a trail, and all your logs will be stored in the S3 bucket, and the most the recent logs you can see in the console itself, right? So here if you see, I have a bucket with my logs, which was probably one of the first buckets which we create, right? So usually as soon as you create your account, root account, you had to go and enable CloudTrail, but these days it is enabled by default. You just have to go and update the bucket name with your bucket name, right? Earlier you had to actually enable CloudTrail, but now the default trail is already enabled for you. But just make sure you go and you store the logs in a S3 bucket. So when you store your logs in an S3 bucket, it is going to look like this. So here you see I've created this bucket on September 16th, 2014. So I have the entire logs from past 6 years. right? So if I go into this, the folder structure is created automatically. You don't have to do anything. Don't worry about the zip file. I created this manually as a backup of the older logs, right? So basically you will see this folder structure, AWS logs. Inside that you will have your account number. Inside that you will have a folder called CloudTrail. Don't worry about this digest, right? So you will go to CloudTrail, right? So inside this you will have a folder for each region, because I enabled CloudTrail for all regions, right? So if you don't use a region, it will not have logs, right? So we use US East 1 a lot. So if I go to US East 1, it will have a folder for each of the years from 14 to 20. So if I go to 14, it will have a folder for each of the month, because I created this in September. It starts with September 09. Then you will have a folder for each of the dates. I created it on September 16. So 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, right? So if I go into 16, you can see the logs for 16. For auditing purpose, for security purposes, you can uh, have this. So mostly you might never use these things, but uh, what do you say, in big companies it is required to store the logs at least for 2 or 3 years. So you can keep it like this. You can apply a life cycle policy to put the old logs in Glacier or whatever, but it does not occupy much space, right? It will hardly cost you the few rupees to store these logs, right? To store these logs. So it is a good practice to enable what do you say, to store your CloudTrail logs, so that you can track, or your security or your auditing team, they can track, or if something happens, there is a breach or something happens, they can track who did that, right? Which is again a good reason to have separate credentials for each of the users, so that you know who is doing what, right? So any questions on this so far of CloudTrail? So at this level, you know CloudTrail, it is more than enough, right? Right. So basically, you have to know uh, what is the management event, and right, the data events. Okay. So that is basically CloudTrail. It also comes under the security topic, right? So the next thing, what shall we see? Yeah, we need to talk about the policies, right? We have another half an hour or so. Yeah. So what we'll do is we'll come back to policies probably in the next class, right? So we'll talk about the AWS CLI now, right? We saw about the console access, right? So programmatic access. So programmatic access, like I told you, anything other than this AWS console is programmatic access. Whether you're using a third-party tool, third-party GUI tool, a third-party application, a website, or something, right? They are all called programmatic access, right? So I have a user Harry. I have given him both the console access and programmatic access. Now, for us at the administrator level, or the ops level, or the architect level, you just need to have some basic idea about the AWS CLI. Right? So we saw IAM, right? We saw what is a user, right? What is a group, right? What is MFA, right? What is a user, what is an IAM user, and what is a root user. So the root user will not be shown under IAM, right? So remember, root user is not a IAM user. Root user you cannot see over here. You will not see the root user here. There is only one root user. It can be managed only if you log in as the root user. Everything else is a, think of it as a, all these are IAM users, right? You can't create another root user even if you want to, right? So to manage the root user, you log in as the root user, right? To manage the root user, you log in as the root user, right? You saw what is a group, what is multi-factor authentication, right? So what are the credentials, right? That is the console access and the programmatic access, right? So programmatic access, where can we use? I told you anything apart from the official console, right? So now AWS has a CLI also, right? AWS has a command line interface that you can use, right? So you can interact with AWS from their console or programmatically. Programmatically includes anything else. It also includes CLI. It includes your SDKs, APIs for people using AWS to develop applications. We are not going to go into those things, right? So they have SDKs for Java, .NET, Python, all that stuff, right? So basically, you just need to know what is this CLI, right? So how do you install the AWS CLI, right? So how do you install the AWS CLI? So you go to AWS CLI, right? Go to this URL, you download and install it. It is pretty straightforward. You download the 64-bit package, you double click install like any Windows software. If you are using Mac OS or the Linux, the instructions are given over here, right? You can install it on any machine. You can install it on your laptop. You can install it on a EC2 instance also. If you are using Amazon Linux, CLI is already installed. You don't have to install it. If you are using RHEL or something other EC2 instance, you can install the CLI over there. It is the same step. How to install the CLI? Whatever flavor you are doing, the instructions are given over there, right? You download the package for Windows. You double click, you install, right? So it installs the dependencies and the scripts or the packages which are required for the CLI to run. So how do you open the CLI? So there is no, what do you say? You can't go here and search for AWS CLI, right? So it is basically your command prompt or the PowerShell or the terminal. There is no special screen or app for the CLI, right? It just installs the required packages and the stuff for this to work. So if I go to my control panel and check, right, you will see AWS CLI installed, right? The latest version is version 2. So make sure your CLI is up to date, because whenever AWS adds some new features or new services, right, they update the CLI. Because the old CLI, it will not have those options. Basically, it is installing the packages which are required, right? So it is here, but you can't, I mean, you don't have any special app. It is your command line or the PowerShell. The commands are the same. Whether you are using it on Windows or Linux or Mac, the commands are the same. If you are using the Linux, you open the terminal, you run your commands. If you are using Windows, you open PowerShell or you open command prompt, you run. The commands are the same. There is no special app for this, right? So once you install the CLI, how do you use the CLI? So here they have given the instructions. So we will just open this too and keep. Right? What is the CLI? So here is what, like, you can open it from the command prompt or PowerShell or from the Linux terminals on Macs, or you can use it via EC2 also, right? If you are doing it, if you have a EC2 instance, on that also you can install the CLI. So basically the CLI provides access to all the APIs of AWS services. So remember, in AWS, everything is a API call. So even here, when I click create instance or create security group, it is making a API call called create security group. So because AWS is all, everything can be done programmatically. Whatever you are doing in the console, everything can be done programmatically, right? So again, they're talking about the versions, right? So the current version is 2, right? You ideally want to use the latest version, right? So again, 2 point, they keep updating. So if some command is not working, right, probably your CLI is not up to date, right? If you have a old CLI and you try to access some new service or some new option, it might not work because that feature was not installed. Okay, so once you install the CLI, how do you start using it? Right, here is the description. So whatever service you want, everything has its own, what do you say, options, its own commands. The basic syntax is going to be starting with AWS options, the command, subcommand, and parameters. It depends upon the service. You cannot learn this entire thing, but you have to know what those services are. right? If you know the services, you know the actions, then you can use this, right? Without knowing the service, without knowing the actions, you can't do anything. Now, for example, EC2, we go, right? Let us go to EC2. So under EC2, you have all these things, right? Your VPC, all those come under EC2, right? So whatever you want to do, everything has a command, but you should know what these are, right? So they are pretty, what do you say, easy to, by looking at the command, you will know what it is. Attach a VPN gateway, right? Attach a volume to an instance, attach a network interface, attach internet gateway. We know what these are. We know what is internet gateway. We know where to attach the internet gateway, right? Right? So everything here you have. You want to stop instance, so you can just go straight to stop somewhere, right? So if you go over here, right, here you see stop instances. So what is this command going to do? You click on this, right? Stop instance. It stops a EC2 instance, right? Again, some description about the stop. We already saw all these things, right? So you won't be charged for stopped instance, all that stuff. So what is the actual command here, right? It is going to be AWS stop instances followed by instance IDs, and you need to specify the instance ID, and then you have other options, right? So what are those other options? Hibernate. You want to hibernate the machine, right? You don't want to, what is this dry run is, you want to check whether the command will run or not run. Without actually executing the action, it is going to check whether it is going to work or not work. Right? We will see these things, right? And they have given an example, right? You can straight away, you choose the command, you come down to the example. AWS EC2 stop instances, instance ID, and this ID. So what is this command going to do? It is going to stop an instance with this instance ID, right? So like this, for every command you will have an example, basic syntax. So you don't have to go through the entire page, but you have to know what is an instance, what is stop instance, right? So like that you can go, you just have to go through this document. We can't cover everything, right? So if you want to start an instance, the command is going to be start instance, right? So again, it is going to be start instance, instance ID, and some additional options. What are the options? What can they do? So here is the example, AWS EC2. So it will start with AWS, the service name, followed by the command, and followed by the options, right? So same thing, you want to do something with S3, right? So now we are in EC2. So now you want to work with S3. So you go to the S3 documentation, right? So S3 has two documentations. I mean, two things. One is high level S3 commands, and one is API level, right? So at least the high level you can practice, right? So API, you have a lot more options, right? Basically, whatever you can do in the console, everything you can do with the programmatic access, right? You can enable versioning, you can create a static website hosting, right? Everything you can do over here. So all these are API level commands, S3 API. If you want high level commands, that is, you just want to manage objects, right? You use the S3 high level commands. High level commands, you have just 4 or 5 commands. These are the commands. You just scroll down. If you scroll down somewhere, yeah. So these are the commands: copy, list, make bucket, move bucket, pre-sign URL, remove bucket, rename bucket, sync, static website hosting. These are high level commands, right, which are available with S3. So you want to copy the contents of your local folder to S3, or you want to copy the contents of one S3 bucket to another S3 bucket. So some people use this in scripts, right? So the command is cp followed by local path and S3 URL, or one S3, you want to download file from S3 to local path, or you want to copy from one S3 path to another S3 path, right? So you don't worry about all these things. Just scroll straight down. You will see the example, because only with the example you can start learning. You go to the example. So copying a local file to S3, the command is going to be AWS S3 CP your local file name followed by the S3 location, the bucket location followed by the object name. Here if you give a different object name, it will be uploaded with a different name, right? Same thing, you want to copy file from one S3 bucket to another S3 bucket, right? Or you want to actually change the name of the file, you can say AWS S3 copy the source and the destination, right? You want to copy from S3 to your machine, you can do that, right? All these are under the copy command, right? Similarly, you have sync, right? Sync some people use for backup. Suppose they have some backup on their server, right, on their machine, they want to sync it to a S3 bucket, they want to upload everything, you can use sync, right? You can use this command, right? You can say AWS S3 dot sync. Dot means the current path, right? So whatever is there in the current folder, it will all be uploaded to the S3 bucket, right? It syncs an objects under a specified prefix and bucket to files in a local directory, right? So you can use this, right, to sync either way, right? Sync your folder to S3 or sync your S3 to folder, right? So all these are available. So pretty much whatever you can do in the console plus a lot more you can do, right? In the console you can't do sync and all that stuff, right? But programmatically you can do a lot more than what you can do in the console. So how do you start using this? So we have installed the CLI. So what is the command? So for example, I will take S3, it will be easier for you to understand. So let me open S3 in the console also, right? So let me open S3 in the console also, right? So we'll go ahead and we'll create a bucket for ourselves, right? So I will just call this demo November 8th. I'm going to create in US East 1. So again, I have to scroll all the way down and say create bucket. Right? So I have created this bucket. Now let us say I want to upload some file in this bucket. So how do I do that? Now say for example, I have some file over here, right? So let me go into my folder. I think it is 1 second. Let me go to this folder. Yeah, right. So in this folder I have some Linux commands I keep using, right? So here I have a file called 1.txt, right? In this folder called demo on my C drive, right? I have a folder called 1.txt. Now say I want to upload this to my S3 bucket. So what is the command? I have installed the CLI, right? So I want to copy this file from my local machine to S3. So what is the thing, right? You say AWS S3 CP, your file name followed by the S3 location. So what am I going to say? I'm going to say AWS S3 CP 1.txt to S3 colon. What is our bucket name? Sorry, what is our bucket name? Demo November 8th. Right? And here I can just leave it like this, or I can give a different name. If I give a different name, then this 1.txt will be uploaded as 2.txt. That's what they have shown in this example. Don't get confused. Here what is happening is, it is uploading this file with a different name, which you probably may not be able to do from the console, right? But from the CLI, you can upload the file with a different name also. If you don't specify the name, it uploads with the same name. Now if I execute this command, what happens? So let me open this bucket. right? Currently this bucket is empty.
So, Siddharth, so now we are given as 1.txt, right? So we want to upload it as 2.txt. So this we can't do it in a console.
Yeah, you can't.
So the name should be same in console, right?
Yeah, so in console, when you try to upload, what happens? You put your file, it uploads with the same name.
Okay.
Afterwards, you can go and
Okay.
change the name of the file. But while uploading
Okay.
itself, I think at present you can't do it,
Okay.
right? So if you don't give any name, it uploads with the same name. So now if I hit enter, what will happen? It will give error. Why it gave error? Because we have not provided the credentials. Just because you install CLI, it is not going to work automatically, right? You have to give the credentials. How does it know to which AWS account it has to connect to? Right? I just installed the CLI. You didn't see me give any credentials, right? So how do you provide the credentials? So you can configure the credentials. So after you install the CLI, you run the command AWS configure, right? It is like your, what do you say? Like logging into the console. You cannot just open AWS console and start doing the work, right? You provide your credentials, you provide your authentication. So for the CLI also you have to provide authentication. So you run the command AWS configure. So it will ask you for your access key and secret access key. So we have our access key and secret access key. So I can take this, I can put this over here, right? Which is my access key ID. Next it will ask for the secret access key. I provide this. This is my secret access key, right? And then it will ask you what is the region, because in the console it is easy. You can choose the region over here, but in the CLI you have to specify, you have to be more specific. The default is US East 1, that is the region. Here you can't say Ohio, North Virginia. You have to use the region code. You have to say US East 1, which is the region in which you want to run the command, right? I'm saying US East 1. It is the default, so I'm keeping it as enter. Output is whenever you execute a command, you will get an output. It can be in text, JSON, table. I'm just leaving it at text. Okay. So now we have configured the CLI. That is, we have provided our credentials. Now you can exit and you can come back again. It does not matter. Those credentials are saved. Right? Doesn't matter. Those credentials will be saved. Now if I run the command AWS S3 CP, right? 1.txt to S3 colon slash slash. What is our demo? November 8. Now what will happen? Now what is it saying? Earlier if you see, it would have said the credentials are invalid. Now it is saying access denied. Here you are authenticated but you are not authorized. Why you are not authorized? Because Harry, he does not have the permission. What permission does Harry have? I have used the credentials of Harry, right, for the console. So you don't give the username password, you just give this combination. It knows it is for Harry, right? These credentials were created for Harry. So now in the console I'm running these commands as Harry. So what permission he has? He does not have any permission, which is why you are getting access denied error for Harry. Right? Now if I add some permission for Harry, say for example, I will give him access to S3. Say for example, I will add him to these groups. Just for showing you, right? So now if I try to run the command, what will happen? It said upload. You didn't get error, right? It returned some value, right? Upload 1.txt to from this current folder to S3, this thing to this file. It used the same name. Now if I go to S3 and I refresh over here, you will see that 1.txt, right? Now same command, now instead of saying 1.txt, if I put 2. Something, does not matter. Now it is going to upload 1.txt with a different name, 2. YTFH. So if I go here and refresh, you will see another file 2 dot something, right? So S3 does not care about the content, it is only the file name, right? So if you upload the same file again with the same name, what will happen? If I upload 1.txt, it will upload. This file will be written. It will be 1057. Now it will be 1058. Right? It is going to overwrite. That is the default behavior. It does not care about the content of the file. It is just the key. Okay. So it depends upon the permission that you have. So like this, you have a lot of commands. So these commands you just have to try one by one, whatever you want to do. Right? Same thing. You can download a file also. Right? You can copy file from one S3 bucket to another S3 bucket. Right? You can do all these things. Right? Suppose you want to copy S3 buckets to a local directory. You want to download all files from this bucket to your local machine. You can run this command. Right? You want to have the same folder structure and you want to download everything inside that bucket. Right? You have multiple folders and all that stuff. You can do that. Right? You can say AWS S3 CP. You copy these files. So you can just take the same command and you can just replace it. Replace your bucket names. Right? I can say AWS S3. I can say so when I run this command, it is going to download both the files into my current path. Right? So here if I go and see, you will see both these files downloaded. Created now. Right? So like this you can use it to either to download all files from a folder, or you want to upload all files from one folder in your server into S3. Right? You can use this in scripts also. Right? You can do, right? You want to copying local files to S3 from this directory to S3 by excluding certain files. Right? So you have a lot more options over here, which may not be possible from the console. Right? These type of things are not possible from the console. Right? You can exclude. Right? You can do a lot of things. Right? Pretty much whatever you can do in the console plus a lot more things. Right? You can do. Right? So options, again, you can't remember everything. Right? See, all these are the options. Right? Most of them we might never use, but some of them, at least what is given in the examples, if you go through, it is more than enough. Right? Most commonly used stuff is given as examples. Right? So this, you just copy the commands, you paste it, you have to know what to rename. For that you have to know the service. Without knowing the service, you can't use the command line. Which is why first, if you get used to the console, to practice in the console, then you can do the same thing or more using the CLI. So CLI, don't think people are going to manually do these things. Like I said, you can include this command in a script, a bash script or a PowerShell script, which is going to back up your files. Right? For those type of things, it is not like only to manually execute these commands like I'm doing now. You can put it in a bash script of Windows, batch file, or a PowerShell script to do certain actions.
Okay.
Like you said, you want to stop some machines, say at 6 p.m. Right? You can create a script using EC2 stop instances, and that script can run every day evening at 8 p.m. and every day morning at 6 a.m. So at 6 p.m. in the evening, it stops your machines. Morning 6 a.m. it is going to start your machines. Right? So those type of things you can use the CLI. It is not just for manually executing commands. These commands can be used in scripts. Right? Okay.
Okay, sir. Yep.
So you need to install the CLI and configure the CLI. For now, you can do that, but actually it is not a good practice, because when you configure the CLI, what happens is the keys are stored in plain text on your machine. When I configure the CLI, I told you, even if I close this and I again open it and I say AWS S3 LS, so it is a command to list all buckets. Right? So you see it is working. I closed my command prompt, I opened again, I ran the command, it is working. It is showing me all my buckets and whatever I want I can do, right? So what is the problem with this is when you say AWS configure and you save that information, right? It is actually stored on your machine. It is stored in Windows, for example, it is stored in the user profile. There is a folder called .aws. Inside that you have two folders called config and credentials. If you open this, that is that, right? Let me open with whatever text editor you can open, right? So here you will see the key, right? If you see, this key is the same thing that I entered, right? Is it the same? So people can get hold of this. So how to avoid saving credentials? We will see that in the coming classes. And other thing is you can create profiles. So if you are using CLI with different AWS accounts, here I have configured one account. Now say you are using with 3 accounts. So every time you want to execute a command with a different account, again you have to say AWS configure and you have to provide that other account's access key, right? Again it will get overwritten. So instead of that, what you can do is you can save multiple accounts as profiles, right? You can save that as profiles. So you will have that in the config, right? Config and credentials, right? So in the config you have the default, the region and the text, and under credentials you can create different profiles. The default profile is default. So you can create profiles for different thing and you can switch between profiles without having to configure the keys. But again, it is not a good way to do this because your credentials are going to be stored as plain text. So how to avoid that, we will see in the upcoming class, right? So after you finish practicing, to be safe, what you can do is whatever the user you have created, right? Whatever the user you have created, you can remove that user. Either you can remove the permissions, keep the user, or you can just remove the user itself to just be safe, right? So here it is just saying Harry has been using in the past, very recently. Are you sure you want to remove this user? Yes, I want to remove, right? So once you remove the user, only the user is gone. Whatever he has created will be there, okay? So the user inside this bucket, he put some objects, it will be there. He is not the owner of the objects. Who is the owner? The root account, right? So now here if you go, those credentials will still be saved, but it will not work because I have removed the user. These credentials are invalid now, right? Even though those credentials are still saved, they are invalid because this access key does not exist because I removed the user, right? The user itself is gone. So his access keys, everything is gone, right? So after you practice, you can just remove the user. So these users, all these are free. CLI is also free. You only pay for the standard, the data transfer charges, data storage, or whatever the user is free is doing. The user, the groups, the policies, all these are free of cost. There is no cost involved for this. Okay.
Okay.
So you can just go through these topics, right? So people preparing for the exam, you can just focus on the questions. But for practicing, you can just go through what is IAM. So in the next class, we will be talking about the policies, which is basically the core of all this IAM, right? So for now, you can just create a user, try to log in, those type of stuff, right? If you want, you can try out the policies, right? They have some default policies that AWS provides, right? So you can use the policies which have this yellow box. Probably you might not see other policies. You can just filter policies by AWS managed, right? And if you want, for example, for S3 full access, you can just search for S3. They have a default policy that provides full access or the read-only access. So you can attach these policies to the user. You create a user and you can say for example, I have a user. You create a user and you can say add permission, and you can just say attach existing policies, and you can simply maybe use the S3 policy. You can say S3 and you can just attach the S3 full access or the S3 read-only policy for practicing purpose, right? So in the coming classes, we will see how to create our own policies and how do you manage the permissions and all that stuff, right? So you can practice creating what do you say, the MFA code, creating users, and maybe just going through some basic documentation about IAM, right? Or at least you go through the, like I said, after every course you just go through the AWS IAM FAQ. Simple. At least the first 4 or 5 what do you say questions. What is IAM? What is user management? What is role management? Simple, right? What is a user? What can a user do? Right? Basically, just scroll down 4 or 5 pages, enough, right?
Okay, Shiz.
Okay. So we'll catch up in the next class, right? So meanwhile, in between, if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and ping me on WhatsApp, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.